August 14, 2024, the day the dollar's fragility became undeniable. Let me tell you about the moment I realized we were standing at the edge of something far bigger than another Latin American crisis. It wasn't the headlines about Venezuela's disputed election, or even the predictable condemnations from Washington. No, it was the quiet, almost imperceptible shift in how the world's central banks were moving their money. On that day, the People's Bank of China announced it had increased its gold reserves for the 18th consecutive month. Not a dramatic spike, just a steady, methodical accumulation, the kind that doesn't make headlines but sends shivers down the spines of those who understand what it means. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the Russian Finance Ministry confirmed it had settled a $1.2 billion trade deal with India in rubles and rupees, bypassing the dollar entirely. And in Caracas, Nicolas Maduro, fresh off his contested re-election, stood before a crowd of supporters and declared, with a smirk, that Venezuela would now accept payments for oil in yuan, rubles, or even digital currencies, but not dollars. None of these events were front-page news in the West. But taken together, they were the first cracks in the dam. And if you know where to look, you can see the water seeping through. I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of geopolitics and global finance, advising governments, hedge funds, and intelligence agencies on the hidden fault lines of the international system. And what I'm about to tell you isn't just another analysis of Venezuela's political turmoil. It's about how a conflict in Caracas, whether by design or by accident, could be the spark that finally breaks the dollar's 80-year dominance. And if that happens, the world you live in will change in ways most people can't even imagine. But first, let's talk about what you've been told. The official democracy, sanctions, and the usual suspects. If you've been following the news, here's the story: Venezuela is a failed state, a dictatorship run by a corrupt strongman who stole an election, starves his people, and thumbs his nose at the international community. The US and its allies have imposed sanctions to pressure Maduro into holding free and fair elections, but he's dug in, relying on support from Russia, China, and Iran to prop up his regime. The humanitarian crisis is worsening, migration is spilling over into Colombia and Brazil, and the only solution is more pressure, maybe even military intervention if things get bad enough. The numbers seem to back this up. The Venezuelan economy has shrunk by 75% since 2013. Inflation once hit 1 million%. Over 7 million people have fled the country. The US has sanctioned over 150 Venezuelan officials, frozen billions in assets, and banned imports of Venezuelan oil. The European Union, Canada, and most Latin American nations have followed suit. The International Criminal Court is investigating Maduro for crimes against humanity. And in July 2024, the US recognized opposition leader Edmundo Gonzalez as the legitimate winner of Venezuela's presidential election, despite Maduro's claims of victory. This is the story of a rogue regime defying the rules-based international order. And if you believe it, the solution seems more sanctions, more isolation, maybe even a humanitarian intervention to remove Maduro and restore democracy. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's not that any of the facts are wrong, exactly. Venezuela is in crisis. Maduro is an authoritarian. The election was flawed. But the story you're being told is a carefully curated half-truth, designed to obscure the real stakes. Because what's happening in Venezuela isn't just about one country's descent into dictatorship. It's about the death spiral of American hegemony. And the dollar is the rope in this tug-of-war. Deconstructing the what they're not telling you. Let's start with the sanctions. The US will tell you they're targeted, surgical, designed to hurt the regime without harming the people. But the data doesn't support that. A 2022 study by the Center for Economic and Policy Research found that US sanctions on Venezuela were responsible for at least 40,000 deaths between 2017 and 2018 alone, mostly from preventable causes like lack of medicine and malnutrition. By 2024, that number is almost certainly in the hundreds of thousands. Now, you might say, well, Maduro is the one who mismanaged the economy. And you'd be right partially. But here's what no one in Washington wants: US sanctions didn't just accelerate Venezuela's collapse, in many ways, they caused it. Before 2017, Venezuela was a dysfunctional but functioning petrostate. After the Trump administration imposed a full oil embargo in 2019, the economy went into freefall. Why? Because Venezuela's entire economy was built around oil exports to the US. Cut that off, and you don't just hurt the regime, you strangle the country. But here's where it gets interesting. The sanctions weren't just about punishing Maduro. They were about controlling Venezuela's oil. You see, in 2018, the US quietly granted exemptions to Chevron and other American oil companies, allowing them to keep operating in Venezuela despite the embargo. Why? Because the US didn't want to destroy Venezuela's oil industry, it wanted to take it over. And that's exactly what happened. By 2023, US oil companies were back in Venezuela, extracting crude under the guise of humanitarian licenses, while the rest of the country starved. So let's the US imposed sanctions that killed tens of thousands of people, then turned around and let American corporations profit from the chaos. And now, when Maduro pushes back, when he starts selling oil to China in yuan, or when he threatens to nationalize assets held by US companies, Washington acts shocked. Shocked. As if this were some unpredictable turn of events, rather than the entirely foreseeable result of a policy designed to fail. But the real story isn't just about oil. It's about the dollar. The dollar's Achilles. Venezuela as the first domino. For 80 years, the US dollar has been the foundation of global finance. It's the world's reserve currency, the medium of exchange for oil, commodities, and international trade. And for 80 years, that's given the US an unprecedented the ability to print money to fund wars, bail out banks, and run deficits without consequence. But that advantage is eroding. And Venezuela is the first major test of whether the dollar's dominance can survive the 21st century. Here's how it works. When a country like Venezuela sells oil, it typically does so in dollars. Those dollars then flow into the US financial system, where they're used to buy treasury bonds, invest in American assets, or settle international debts. This creates a constant demand for dollars, which keeps the currency strong and allows the US to borrow at low interest rates. It's the ultimate soft power. The world needs dollars to function, so they have to play by America's rules. But what happens when a country stops using dollars? In 2019, Venezuela started selling oil to China in yuan. In 2020, it began accepting rubles from Russia. In 2023, it announced it would accept digital currencies for oil payments. And in 2024, Maduro declared that all future oil sales would be settled in non-dollar currencies. This wasn't just defiance, it was an existential threat to the dollar system. Because if Venezuela can do it, why can't others? Saudi Arabia is already selling oil to China in yuan. Russia is settling trade with India in rubles. Iran and China are using digital currencies to bypass US sanctions. And if enough countries follow suit, the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency could collapse. And if that happens, the US loses its ability to print money without consequence. Interest rates would skyrocket. The stock market would crash. The US would no longer be able to afford its global military presence. In short, the American empire would unravel. This is why Venezuela matters. It's not just about one country's political crisis. It's about whether the dollar system, America's greatest source of power, can survive in a multipolar world. And that's why the US can't afford to let Maduro win. The geopolitical how Venezuela became the front line of a new Cold War. Let's out for a moment. Because what's happening in Venezuela isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader struggle between the US and its rivals, Russia, China, and Iran, for control of the 21st century. From a realist perspective, this is classic great power competition. The US wants to maintain its unipolar dominance, while Russia and China are pushing for a multipolar world where no single country calls the shots. And Venezuela is the perfect battleground for this struggle. Why? Because Venezuela sits on the largest oil reserves in the world, even bigger than Saudi Arabia's. And in a world where energy is power, controlling Venezuela's oil is like controlling the global economy's lifeblood. But it's not just about oil. It's about who controls the oil. If Venezuela sells its oil in dollars, the US wins. If it sells in yuan or rubles, China and Russia win. This is why Russia and China have propped up Maduro. In 2019, Russia sent Wagner Group mercenaries to protect Maduro from a US-backed coup. In 2020, China extended Venezuela a $5 billion line of credit. In 2023, Iran began supplying Venezuela with drones and military advisors. And in 2024, all three countries announced a joint naval exercise in the Caribbean, a direct challenge to US dominance in its own backyard. Now, let me be, I'm not saying Maduro is he's a thug, a dictator, and a terrible leader. But from a geopolitical standpoint, his survival is a strategic necessity for Russia and China. Because if the US succeeds in removing him, it doesn't just win Venezuela, it sends a message to every other country thinking about ditching the do so at your peril. This is why the US is so desperate to remove Maduro. It's not about democracy. It's about power. And if you don't believe me, just look at the history. Historical: the ghosts of Cuba, Iraq, and Libya. If you want to understand what's happening in Venezuela, you don't need to look any further than Cuba, Iraq, and Libya, three countries that dared to challenge US hegemony and paid the price. Let's start with Cuba. In 1960, Fidel Castro nationalized American oil refineries on the island. The US responded by imposing a trade embargo that's lasted over 60 years. The goal? To strangle Cuba's economy and force regime change. Did it work? No. Cuba survived, and the US ended up looking like a bully while the rest of the world moved on. Then there's Iraq. In 2000, Saddam Hussein announced he would start selling oil in euros instead of dollars. 2 years later, the US invaded, removed Saddam, and put Iraq's oil back on the dollar standard. Coincidence? I'll let you decide. And finally, Libya. In 2011, Muammar Gaddafi proposed creating a gold-backed African currency to replace the dollar and euro in African trade. A few months later, NATO bombed Libya, Gaddafi was killed, and Libya's gold reserves disappeared. Again, coincidence? The pattern is when a country threatens the dollar system, the US responds with regime change. And Venezuela is the next domino. But here's the unlike Cuba, Iraq, or Libya, Venezuela has powerful allies. Russia and China aren't going to let the US remove Maduro without a fight. And that's where things get dangerous. Military: the slippery slope to war. Right now, the US is walking a tightrope in Venezuela. On one hand, it's imposing sanctions, recognizing the opposition, and quietly supporting anti-Maduro factions. On the other hand, it's trying to avoid a direct military confrontation with Russia and China. But let's be, the US has a long history of military intervention in Latin America. And if history is any guide, it's only a matter of time before someone in Washington starts pushing for a limited strike or a humanitarian invasion. Here's how it would likely go. 1. Phase: economic warfare. The US tightens sanctions, freezes more Venezuelan assets, and pressures allies to do the same. This is already happening. 2. Phase: covert operations. The CIA and special forces train and arm opposition groups, while cyber attacks target Venezuela's infrastructure. This is also already happening. 3. Phase: false flag or humanitarian pretext. A chemical attack by Maduro's forces, or a massacre of protesters, is used to justify intervention. Sound familiar? It should. This is how the US justified interventions in Syria, Libya, and Iraq. 4. Phase: limited strikes. The US bombs Venezuelan military targets, ostensibly to protect civilians or restore democracy. Russia and China condemn the strikes but don't intervene directly. 5. Phase: full-scale invasion. If Maduro doesn't fall quickly, the US escalates, sending in ground troops. At this point, Russia and China have to: do they let the US take Venezuela, or do they respond? Now, let me be, I'm not saying a US-Russia war is inevitable. But the risk is real. And the hawks in Washington who think this will be a quick and easy war should remember Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. Because once you start a war, you can't control how it ends. And if Russia and China decide to respond, say, by sending troops to Venezuela, or by targeting US bases in Colombia or AMA, then we're looking at a direct great power conflict. And in a world with nuclear weapons, that's a risk no one should be willing to take. The domestic political: why the US can't back down. So why is the US taking this risk? Why not just accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere and move on? The answer lies in domestic politics. Right now, the Biden administration is in a tough spot. Inflation is still high, the border crisis is out of control, and the 2024 election is shaping up to be a referendum on Biden's competence. And nothing rallies a divided country like a foreign enemy. If Biden can frame Venezuela as a battle between democracy and dictatorship, he might be able to distract from his domestic failures. But it's not just about Biden. It's about the broader foreign policy establishment. The neoconservatives who pushed for the Iraq War are still in power in Washington. The think tanks that advocated for regime change in Libya are still shaping policy. And the military-industrial complex that profits from endless war is still calling the shots. And let's not forget Florida. With its large Venezuelan exile community, Florida is a critical swing state. And right now, both parties are tripping over themselves to prove who's tougher on Maduro. If Biden looks weak on Venezuela, he loses Florida. And if he loses Florida, he loses the election. So the incentives are escalate, don't back down, and hope Maduro blinks first. But here's the Maduro isn't Saddam Hussein. He's not Gaddafi. He's got Russia and China backing him. And if the US pushes too hard, he might not blink, he might push back. Scenario how this could play out. So where does this end? Let's look at 3 possible scenarios, from best case to worst case. Scenario 1, the diplomatic off-ramp. In this scenario, the US and Venezuela reach a negotiated settlement. Maduro agrees to new elections in exchange for sanctions relief. The US recognizes the results even if Maduro wins. Russia and China pressure Maduro to compromise, and the crisis de-escalates. This is the best-case scenario, but it's unlikely. Why? Because the US foreign policy establishment doesn't do compromise. And Maduro knows that if he gives an inch, the US will take a mile. Scenario 2, the frozen conflict. This is the most likely outcome. The US keeps up the pressure, but doesn't invade. Maduro survives, but Venezuela remains isolated. The country's economy continues to stagnate, and the humanitarian crisis worsens. Russia and China keep propping up Maduro, but don't escalate militarily. The dollar's dominance erodes slowly, but the system doesn't collapse. This is the muddling through scenario. It's not great, but it's not catastrophic. The problem is, it's unstable. Because as long as Maduro is in power, the US will keep pushing. And as long as the US keeps pushing, Russia and China will keep pushing back. Scenario 3, the Great Unraveling. This is the nightmare scenario. The US invades Venezuela, or Maduro does something so provocative that the US feels it has no choice but to respond. Russia and China intervene, either directly or by proxy. The dollar system collapses as countries abandon the currency en masse. Global markets icy, and the world descends into a new Cold War, or worse, a hot one. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night. Because once the dollar's dominance is broken, there's no going back. And the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for the US, but for the entire world. The grand strategy why the US is losing the 21st century. Let's take a step back and ask the big why is the US in this mess in the first place? The answer is because for the last 30 years, the US has pursued a strategy of primacy, an attempt to maintain absolute dominance over the global system, not just militarily but economically, financially, and culturally. The problem isn't that the US is weak, the problem is that primacy was always a fantasy. Empires don't last forever, and the 21st century is proving that the American century was never as permanent as Washington assumed. Now, what most people don't realize is that the dollar's dominance wasn't just a byproduct of American economic strength, it was a deliberate construction, a weaponized system built on the ruins of World War II. The Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 didn't just make the dollar the world's reserve currency, it made the dollar the world's enforcer. Every major commodity, from oil to gold, was priced in dollars, and every country that wanted to trade had to hold them. That gave the US an exorbitant the ability to run deficits without consequence, to sanction entire nations out of existence, and to project power without firing a shot. But here's the uncomfortable: that system was always unsustainable. No empire, no matter how powerful, can indefinitely demand that the rest of the world finance its wars, its debt, and its consumption. And yet, for decades, Washington acted as if it could. The US spent trillions on wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, printed money to bail out banks in 2008, and now runs a national debt north of $34 trillion, all while expecting the rest of the world to keep holding dollars as if nothing had changed. That's not strategy, that's arrogance. And the cracks are showing. When the US froze Russia's foreign reserves after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, it wasn't just a financial move, it was a geopolitical earthquake. Countries like China, India, Brazil, and Saudi Arabia saw the writing on the if the US could weaponize the dollar against Russia, it could do the same to them. So they started hedging. China has been dumping US treasuries for years, reducing its holdings from a peak of $1.3 trillion in 2013 to under $800 billion today. India and the UAE are settling oil trades in rupees and dirhams. Even the Saudis, long the linchpin of the petrodollar system, are openly discussing selling oil in yuan. This isn't some abstract academic debate. It's a slow-motion bank run on the dollar. And Venezuela? Venezuela is the test case. If the US can topple Maduro without triggering a broader backlash, it sends the dollar's dominance as absolute, and resistance is futile. But if Maduro survives, and if Russia and China dig in, it sends the opposite: the system is breaking, and the US is no longer invincible. Let me explain why this matters beyond economics. The dollar isn't just a currency, it's the backbone of American power. Without it, the US can't sanction Iran, can't fund Ukraine, can't maintain its global military footprint. And that military footprint? It's the other half of this equation. The US has 750 military bases in 80 countries. It spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. That's not just a show of strength, it's a sign of overstretch. Now, imagine if the dollar's dominance collapses. Suddenly, the US can't afford to keep those bases open. It can't print money to fund wars. It can't sanction adversaries without risking blowback. And that's when the real geopolitical shift happens. Because the US has spent decades telling the do as we say, or we'll cut you off. But if the world stops listening, what's left? This is where the military implications get terrifying. The US has spent the last 30 years fighting asymmetric wars against insurgents in the Middle East. But a conflict in Venezuela wouldn't be asymmetric. It would be a direct confrontation with Russia and China, two nuclear-armed powers with their own global ambitions. And unlike Iraq or Afghanistan, Venezuela is in America's backyard. The Monroe Doctrine isn't just a relic, it's the unspoken rule that the US will not tolerate foreign military bases in the Western Hemisphere. If Russia or China were to establish a permanent presence in Venezuela, say, by deploying air defense systems or even nuclear-capable bombers, the US would have to respond. And that response could escalate quickly. Here's how it could play out. The US invades Venezuela, either directly or through a proxy force. Russia sends military advisors to bolster Maduro's defenses. China, not wanting to be left out, begins supplying advanced weaponry, maybe even hypersonic missiles. The US retaliates by imposing secondary sanctions on any country that trades with Venezuela. Russia and China respond by accelerating their de-dollarization efforts, dumping US treasuries, and encouraging their allies to do the same. The dollar plummets. Interest rates skyrocket. The US economy enters a recession. And suddenly, the world is staring down the barrel of a financial crisis that makes 2008 look like a dress rehearsal. But it gets worse. Because in this scenario, the US isn't just fighting Venezuela, it's fighting a coalition. Russia and China have been preparing for this moment for years. They built alternative financial systems, like the CIPS payment network and the digital yuan. They forged alliances with countries tired of American hegemony, from Iran to North Korea to the BRICS bloc. And they've invested heavily in military technology designed to counter US dominance, hypersonic missiles, anti-satellite weapons, and cyber capabilities that could cripple American infrastructure. The uncomfortable truth is that the US is not prepared for this fight. Its military is designed for power projection, not great power competition. Its economy is built on debt and consumption, not production. And its political system is so polarized that it can't even agree on basic governance, let alone a coherent grand strategy. Meanwhile, Russia and China have spent the last decade preparing for a world where the dollar is no longer king. So where does that leave us? If we're lucky, we get the frozen conflict scenario, a slow erosion of American power, a gradual decline of the dollar, and a multipolar world where no single country calls the shots. That's not ideal, but it's manageable. If we're unlucky, we get the great unraveling, a sudden collapse of the dollar system, a financial crisis, and a military confrontation that could spiral into something far worse. The question isn't whether the dollar system will break. The question is when and whether the US will have the wisdom to manage the transition without catastrophe. Because right now, Washington is sleepwalking toward disaster. And Venezuela? Venezuela is just the first domino. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's crisis isn't just about oil or sanctions or even Maduro's authoritarianism, it's about the raw, unvarnished fact that the country has become a testing ground for a new kind of geopolitical warfare. One where financial systems, domestic politics, and military posturing intersect in ways that make traditional diplomacy look like child's play. And if we're being honest, the US foreign policy establishment has been caught flat-footed by this shift. They still think in terms of coups, color revolutions, and regime change tactics that worked in the 1980s and 1990s but are woefully inadequate in a world where Russia and China are playing 4D chess while Washington is still debating whether to move its pawns. Let me explain why this matters. Venezuela's domestic political landscape is a powder keg, and the fuse is already lit. On one side, you have Nicolas Maduro, a man who has clung to power through a combination of repression, electoral manipulation, and sheer luck. His government is a masterclass in survival, but it's also a house of cards. The economy is in shambles, GDP has contracted by over 75% since 2013, inflation hit 1 million% in 2018, and basic goods like food and medicine are still scarce for most of the population. The only thing keeping Maduro afloat is the military's loyalty, and even that is transactional. The generals aren't ideologues, they're businessmen who've carved out lucrative niches in everything from gold mining to drug trafficking. They'll stick with Maduro as long as the money keeps flowing, but if the US or its allies offer a better deal, they'll switch sides faster than you can say amnesty. On the other side, you have the opposition, which is fractured, disorganized, and increasingly irrelevant. Juan Guaidó, the self-declared interim president, was once the darling of the West, but his star has faded. His 2019 attempt to rally the military against Maduro failed spectacularly, and since then, he's been reduced to a figurehead, tweeting from exile while the real power brokers in Caracas ignore him. The opposition's problem isn't just that Maduro is ruthless, it's that they've never offered a compelling alternative. They're seen as elitist, out of touch, and too cozy with Washington. And let's be after decades of US intervention in Latin America, most Venezuelans aren't exactly eager to invite another one. Here's the uncomfortable: neither side can win this fight on its own. Maduro can't fix the economy, and the opposition can't overthrow him without external help. That's why the real battle is being fought in the shadows, between the US, Russia, China, and a handful of regional players like Colombia and Brazil. And this is where things get dangerous. Take Russia, for example. Moscow has been Maduro's lifeline, providing everything from military advisors to debt relief. In 2019, Russia sent 2 nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in a show of force, and in 2020, it deployed a contingent of Wagner Group mercenaries to protect Maduro's regime. But Russia's involvement isn't just about loyalty, it's about leverage. Venezuela owes Moscow billions of dollars, and if Maduro falls, Russia loses not just a client state but a strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere. That's why Putin has been so vocal in his support for Maduro, even as the US ramps up sanctions. He's not doing it out of the goodness of his heart, he's doing it because Venezuela is a pressure point he can use to squeeze Washington. China, meanwhile, is playing a longer game. Beijing has poured billions into Venezuela's oil sector, but it's also hedging its bets. Unlike Russia, China isn't interested in propping up Maduro indefinitely. It's interested in stability, enough to keep the oil flowing, but not so much that it gets dragged into a quagmire. That's why China has been quietly negotiating with both Maduro and the opposition, positioning itself as a neutral mediator. It's a smart. If Maduro falls, China can pivot to the new government without missing a beat. If he stays, China gets to keep its access to Venezuela's resources. Either way, Beijing wins. Now, let's talk about the US. Because here's where things get really messy. The Biden administration has continued Trump's policy of maximum pressure, but it's not clear what the endgame is. Sanctions have crippled Venezuela's economy, but they haven't toppled Maduro. If anything, they've made him more dependent on Russia and China. And while the US has dangled the carrot of sanctions relief in exchange for free elections, Maduro has no incentive to take the deal. Why would he? He knows that if he allows a fair vote, he'll lose. And if he loses, he'll end up in The Hague or worse. So what's the alternative? Some in Washington are pushing for a more aggressive approach: military intervention, covert operations, or even a full-blown coup. But that's a recipe for disaster. Venezuela isn't AMA or Grenada. It's a country of 28 million people with a well-armed military and a history of fierce resistance to foreign intervention. And Russia and China have made it clear they'll respond if the US tries to remove Maduro by force. We're not just talking about diplomatic protests here. We're talking about cyber attacks, economic retaliation, and even military escalation in other theaters. Let me lay out the most likely scenarios. The first is what I call the slow-motion collapse. Maduro limps along, the economy continues to deteriorate, and Venezuela becomes a failed state in all but name. The US keeps sanctions in place, Russia and China keep propping up the regime, and the opposition remains divided. This is the status quo, and it's the most probable outcome in the short term. It's not pretty, but it's manageable for now. The second scenario is the negotiated transition. The US and its allies offer Maduro a face-saving exit amnesty, a golden parachute, maybe even a role in a transitional government in exchange for free elections. This is what the Biden administration has been hinting at, but it's a long shot. Maduro has no reason to trust the US, and the opposition has no leverage to force his hand. Even if a deal is struck, it could collapse at any moment, leading to more chaos. The third scenario is the Great Unraveling. This is the one that keeps me up at night. It starts with a miscalculation, a US military strike, a Russian or Chinese overreach, or a domestic crisis that spirals out of control. Maybe Maduro dies suddenly, and the military fractures. Maybe the US imposes a naval blockade, and Russia responds by sending more troops. Maybe China decides to call in Venezuela's debts, triggering a financial meltdown. Whatever the spark, the result is a regional crisis that draws in the US, Russia, and China, and accelerates the collapse of the dollar system. Here's why this matters for the bigger picture. Venezuela isn't just a country, it's a microcosm of the new Cold War. It's where the battle lines between the US and its rivals are being drawn, where the limits of American power are being tested, and where the future of the dollar system is being decided. If the US can't manage this crisis, it sends a message to the rest of Washington is no longer the indispensable nation. And that's a message that Russia, China, and the rest of the BRICS bloc are all too happy to amplify. So where does that leave us? The US has a choice to make. It can double down on the failed policies of the past: sanctions, regime change, and military posturing, or it can try something new. It can recognize that the world has changed, that the dollar's dominance is not guaranteed, and that the only way to preserve American power is to adapt. That means engaging with Venezuela not as a client state, but as a sovereign nation. It means working with Russia and China to find a diplomatic solution, even if it's messy. And it means accepting that the era of unipolarity is over. But I'm not holding my breath. Because right now, Washington is still operating under the delusion that it can have its cake and eat it too, that it can sanction Venezuela into submission, contain Russia and China, and maintain the dollar's dominance all at the same time. That's not strategy. That's wishful thinking. And in a world where the stakes couldn't be higher, wishful thinking is a luxury we can't afford. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the structural vulnerabilities of the dollar system itself. The US has spent decades leveraging the dollar's dominance as both a financial weapon and a geopolitical shield, but that dominance is built on a foundation of trust, liquidity, and the perception of invincibility. And trust, as we've seen time and again, is a fragile thing. The moment markets sense that the US is no longer willing or able to enforce its financial hegemony, the system starts to unravel. Venezuela is just the first domino. Let me explain why this matters in concrete terms. The dollar's role as the world's reserve currency isn't just about prestige, it's about power. It allows the US to run deficits without consequence, to impose sanctions that cripple entire economies, and to project influence without firing a shot. But that power is predicated on one critical: that the rest of the world has no viable alternative. And for decades, that assumption held. The euro was too fragmented, the yuan too controlled, gold too cumbersome. But now, that's changing. The BRICS bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and their existing roster of allies isn't just talking about de-dollarization anymore. They're doing it. Take the numbers. In 2014, the dollar accounted for 87% of global foreign exchange reserves. By 2023, that number had dropped to 58%. That's not a blip, it's a trend. And it's accelerating. Russia, after being kicked out of SWIFT in 2022, shifted 80% of its trade with China to yuan and rubles. India is now paying for Russian oil in rupees. Even Saudi Arabia, the linchpin of the petrodollar system, is openly flirting with the idea of pricing oil in currencies other than the dollar. This isn't some abstract future threat, it's happening right now, in real time. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has spent so long treating the dollar as a tool of coercion that it's forgotten it's also a tool of cooperation. Every time Washington weaponizes the dollar through sanctions, asset seizures, or financial exclusion, it erodes the very thing that makes the system confidence. And confidence, once lost, is nearly impossible to regain. The more the US tightens its grip, the more the world slips through its fingers. So what's the alternative? The establishment narrative says the US must double down: more sanctions, more military posturing, more regime change operations. But that's the definition of doing the same thing and expecting a different result. The smarter play is to recognize that the dollar's dominance isn't a birthright, it's a privilege, one that can be revoked. And if the US wants to preserve it, it needs to start acting like a responsible steward, not a bully. That means rethinking sanctions. Right now, the US treats sanctions like a scalpel, but in reality, they're a sledgehammer. They don't just target regimes, they crush entire populations. Venezuela's GDP has contracted by 75% since 2013, not because of socialism, but because of sanctions. And what has that achieved? Has it toppled Maduro? No. Has it weakened Russia or China? No. All it's done is push Venezuela deeper into the arms of America's rivals. If the US wants to compete in the 21st century, it needs to stop treating sanctions as a first resort and start treating them as a last one. It also means engaging with adversaries, not just isolating them. Look at Iran. For years, the US insisted that maximum pressure would bring Tehran to its knees. Instead, it pushed Iran closer to Russia and China, strengthened the hardliners in Tehran, and turned the Middle East into a powder keg. Now, after decades of failure, the US is finally belatedly exploring diplomacy. Why not apply that same logic to Venezuela? Why not offer Maduro a face-saving off-ramp, one that includes sanctions relief in exchange for democratic reforms? It's not about rewarding bad behavior, it's about recognizing that the alternative is far worse. And then there's the military dimension. The US has spent the last 30 years fighting wars in the Middle East, only to realize too late that the real battle is in the Western Hemisphere. Venezuela is the soft underbelly of American power. If Russia or China establishes a permanent military presence there, something both have been quietly working toward, the US would suddenly find itself in a two-front Cold War, with adversaries on its doorstep. That's not a scenario the Pentagon is prepared for. And yet, the US keeps treating Latin America as an afterthought, a region to be managed through coups and covert ops rather than diplomacy and investment. Let me be, I'm not suggesting the US should abandon its interests in Venezuela. But it needs to stop pretending that it can dictate outcomes through brute force. The world has changed. The unipolar moment is over. And if the US doesn't adapt, it will find itself isolated, not just politically, but financially. Now, some will argue that this is all alarmist, that the dollar isn't going anywhere, that Venezuela is a sideshow, that the US still has time to course correct. And maybe they're right. But here's the thing about it: doesn't move in straight lines. It lurches. One day, everything seems stable. The next, the system is in freefall. The fall of the Soviet Union, the 2008 financial crisis, the Arab Spring, all of them seemed impossible until they weren't. And when they happened, the people in charge were always the last to see it coming. So ask, what happens if Venezuela defaults on its debt? What happens if Russia and China step in with a bailout, denominated in yuan or rubles? What happens if other countries in the region, Argentina, Bolivia, even Brazil, start following suit? What happens if the dollar's share of global reserves drops below 50%? At what point does the system reach a tipping point? And when it does, will the US be ready? I don't have all the answers. But I know the status quo is unsustainable. The US can't keep treating the dollar as a weapon and expect the rest of the world to keep using it as a currency. It can't keep treating Venezuela as a pawn and expect the game to stay the same. And it can't keep pretending that the rules of the 20th century still apply in the 21st. The question isn't whether the dollar system will break. The question is when. And the answer to that question may well be written in Caracas.